Excellencies, distinguished participants, please take your seat or take a seat. We still have refreshments outside. If you would like some, we will begin now. This is a morning period since the passing of His Majesty King Bhumibol. So during the morning period, we will begin all the ISIS public forums with the royal anthem. So please observe the anthem. Talk about today. Today is about the AIIB, but I think that we will talk about China, South China Sea, Southeast Asia, a broader context. But before we begin with the presentation on the AIIB report that we have, let me invite the Dean of my faculty, Professor Tangsupvattana, to give us some opening remarks and then proceed to Mr. Manfred.
Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning to all of you and welcome to today's public forum on what's AIIB all about, China, Asia, and contested global order. As we all can see from the news, China's footprints are everywhere. The Chinese economy is now the largest in the world. In terms of geopolitics, China is a dominant player in the South China Sea. On geoeconomics, China's One Belt, One Road initiative is all the rage, having attracted attention far and wide. Together with OBOR has been the ASEAN Infrastructure Investment Bank or AIIB. So far, AIIB has some 57 members with a funding upwards to $100 billion. 2/3 of the ASEAN Development Bank's capital base and 1/2 of the World Bank's. Yet, the AIIB has just started with only a handful of projects. It is too early to tell whether it will become a rival of the ADB for financing development in Asia. But given Asia's substantial needs for infrastructure investment, perhaps there is enough room for two complementary financing vehicles. Today, we are interested to find out more about the AIIB and China's intentions behind its formation. Certainly, China has indicated that it wants to add to all the rules governing Asia, but we don't know yet whether the AIIB, OBOR, and other Beijing different schemes will entirely revise and reshape the rules and institutions in our neighborhoods. To help us learn more, This morning, we will begin with an in-depth report on AIIB by Mr. Mark Grimsditch, who is the Mekong Regional Coordinator at Inclusive Development International. Mr. Grimsditch will present and discuss his findings to kick us off. After that, we will have a lineup of expert discussants, namely Ms. Luz Julieta Rio Ligthart, Mr. Horn Phathanothai, Mr. James Stent, and Mr. Kavi Jongkithawon. Their personal details are available in the handouts from the legislation desk. Let me thank to presenter and all discussants for their time and effort for sharing their expertise with us today. And let's now give a floor to Ajahn Thitinan. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Last year, prior to China's G20 presidency, infrastructure investment featured prominently on the global agenda. In July 2015, the Addis Ababa Action Plan, emanating from the Conference on Financing for Development, established the Global Infrastructure Forum to identify infrastructure gaps and to seek opportunities for investment. In September 2015, the UN Sustainable Development Summit adopted the well-known SDGs, explicitly calling for resilient infrastructure investment in its goal number 9. And last but not least, the end of the year in December, the Paris Climate Conference concluded in December 2015 with an agreement that put much emphasis on the role of infrastructure projects as a decisive factor in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and to curb global warming. At the same time, China, during its presidency of the G20, pledged to further develop the G20 Global Infrastructure Initiative, which was launched in 2014 under Australia's presidency to expand the global demand for bankable quality infrastructure projects. Now, most of these initiatives explicitly recognize infrastructure investment as an essential component for equitable and fair development. SDG 9, for example, spells out and asks for quality, reliable, sustainable, and resilient infrastructure, including regional and transporter infrastructure, which focus on affordable and equitable access for all. Despite these commitments, there are growing indications and also growing concern that the focus of the global infrastructure investment agenda hinges strongly on classic economic infrastructure, such as road, transportation systems, and energy supply, with a market underrepresentation for social infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, and infrastructure for disaster risk management. The finance ministers and central bank governors of the G20 across the board appear to intend to keep the sustainable development track strictly apart from the sustainable development component, relegating the latter to the less influential so-called Sherpa track. In such a political environment, the sheer magnitude of investment volumes quickly becomes a goal in itself, rather than a means to sustainable and equitable outcomes in infrastructure investments. Now, for us as an institution, for the Heinrich Böll Foundation, coherence among economic, social, and environmental policies has always been an essential theme. The more that we are now looking into the German presidency of the G20, officially starting in December this year. And we will follow these trends very closely from now also as beyond in the future. I'm therefore looking at these topics we discussed today I'm therefore extremely grateful to the organizers from the Institute of Security and International Studies, so my counterpart, in particular my counterpart, Ajahn Titinan, and also to the hosts from the Chulalongkorn University, that we have been offered this platform to discuss among many of the relevant stakeholders the paradigms and structures of Chinese infrastructure in this region, which is at the core of our work as a regional office here. And without further ado, I'd like now to finalize, and thanks again also for your participation and your interest in this topic. Thank you very much.
Let me contextualize our forum today in this way. So you've seen the news that President Rodrigo Duterte has been making waves. He has just visited China, Japan. He says a lot of things that people pay attention to. He's a very different kind of leader in the Philippines that we're used to. But I think that he is not dumb. So I know we have some distinguished journalists from the Chinese media, and they want to know about China's role in the region. So Mr. Duterte initially, even after the Permanent Court of Arbitration's ruling on July 12th, to really, say that China has no historic rights in the South China Sea, it has a degraded environment, and so on, and that it has violated Philippine sovereignty. So one would think that a decision like that, fully in favor of the Philippines, would have enticed President Duterte to use as a bargaining chip, as leverage vis-a-vis China. But in fact, he's gone the other way. He actually has moved closer to China, to Beijing, and this has been a trend now during his presidency so far. In the meantime, we can see in the US that they have almost kind of like a presidential circus. They have a lot of drama leading up to the voting day on November 8th. So I think there's something here that we have to bear in mind when we look at AIIB, OBOR, which is now kind of recast as the BRI, Belt Road Initiative. It could be the case that the United States is no longer the reliable superpower in the region. We have 2 treaty allies of America in Southeast Asia. They have 5 in the region: Australia, South Korea, Japan, Philippines, and Thailand. And in fact, Duterte is following in the footsteps of the Thai military government. When we had a coup in May 2014, the Thai military government had to seek support from Beijing because it was ostracized by the Western democracies. But then when Beijing came up with the terms of infrastructure development, rail project, these were tough terms. Interest rate was not so low. Repayment period was rather short. So Thailand, by January 2015, just 7 months after taking power, they went to Japan. So Japan is really doing the bidding around here now for the United States. And with Japan, Thailand then dichotomized or diversified its eggs as to not put them all into the China basket. So now we have rail projects with both, infrastructure projects with both China and Japan. So President Duterte now is doing something similar. In his last shuttled geoeconomic strategy, he has got $43 billion worth of pledges. Now, whether these are realized or something else, but of the 43, 24 billion from China, 19 billion from Japan. So Japan is really a key player now in this region, while the US is absent, or while the US is a little bit out of commission, taking a pause during the presidential election. And now the Obama pivot rebalance, it just sounds very hollow now. It's really a new game in the region, and Duterte has faced up to it, and Thailand saw it earlier. So this is the context we have now for the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, BRI. These are really China's regional global footprints, and they're going some way. I mean, the AIIB is still new. They only have a few projects. We will hear Mark Grimsditch, our main presenter. he has written a report, a comprehensive report on the AIIB, and so he'll give us a presentation of 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will have a lineup of discussants, experts locally and also from abroad to elaborate and tease out some of the key insights. So with that context in mind, with the report, I think we also sent them out by email to participants. I don't know if you've read it, but now you can hear about it from Mr. Grimsditch. Mark, the floor is yours for the next 30 to 40 minutes, please.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to the Dean and to the Institute and Heinrich Böll Foundation for inviting me to present today. My name is Mark Grimsditch. I work for an NGO called Inclusive Development International, which is a US-based human rights organization. Our mission is to make the world economic system more just, more inclusive. We do this through several different streams of work, including research and policy campaigns, training with grassroots groups, and also casework. So starting last year, Heinrich Böll Foundation started to support the work that we do, and a major focus of this was this research report that has been mentioned called Making Inroads. So to begin with, the idea was to look at the AIIB. IDI is, as an organization, has a major focus on financial institutions and accountability at those institutions. And so we've got a lot of experience engaging with the World Bank, with the ADB, with the IFC, engaging with them on policy, on safeguards reform, and on specific projects, and helping communities and affected people to engage with those institutions. But then we started to hear about these new players. So there's the BRICS New Development Bank and also the AIIB. So we needed to work out, what are these banks? Where have they come from? How will they work? How can we engage with these new actors? Because it's inevitable that they will become key players in the global development finance landscape. So that was the motivation, and as an NGO, we're hoping to put this together to help our partners, NGO partners, civil society partners. So that's a bit of context. In terms of this presentation, I can't cover everything that was in that report. I won't bore you with all the details. I'm going to focus on a few things. I don't know exactly where everyone is coming from. I think there's a lot of different backgrounds here. Some people probably know a lot about the bank already, some people less. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on the bank, and then also a little bit of analysis from my own perspective, and hopefully this distinguished panel can contribute. So at the moment, we're in a situation where the global development finance landscape is changing, and it's changing quite rapidly. For decades, international financial institutions, IFIs, were dominated by US, Europe, and Japan, as far as the ADB goes. But now there's a lot more happening. There's Chinese-led and Chinese-backed institutions. Like I mentioned, the New Development Bank, AIIB. Then there's also bilateral Chinese funds and banks, such as the Silk Road Fund. And then in the background, there's this new initiative of China, or at least a rebranding of Chinese outward investment called the One Belt, One Road, or it has many different names now, but I'm going to stick with One Belt, One Road, OBOR. So in this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about the drivers behind these changes, where the AIIB fits in, what exactly the AIIB is, implications for these developments, and then how AIIB fits in with the One Belt, One Road. So first, China and global finance. I'm sure everyone has already heard of the concept of the going out strategy. China, since the early 2000s, has been pushing for more and more outbound investment. Last year, China was the second biggest overseas investor behind Japan. This year, it will probably overtake Japan. And this has been made possible because of strong support from the Chinese government and financing from state banks, also commercial banks and policy banks. At the same time, China's occupying an important role within international financial institutions. But it's no secret that they've been getting increasingly frustrated at the dominance of Western powers within those institutions. So to illustrate that, and this is not just a frustration of China, this is a frustration of other emerging economies and other developing economies. So China is the world's second largest economy, has 20% of the world's population, but has 5% of voting rights at the World Bank. You compare that to 16% held by the US. Then at the AIIB, there's a similar situation where China has 5.5% of voting rights, then US holds 13, Japan holds 13. So this has been on the table for a long time, that this is an issue that is in need of reform, but it's stalled for many years, causing increasing frustration. At the same time, there's no shortage of criticisms of these financial institutions from different angles. Civil society criticized them for being not accountable enough, not transparent enough, and then on the business side, borrowers criticize them for being too slow or having rules that are too strict. What can't be denied is they're expensive to run and often very bureaucratic. So the time it takes from a project being proposed to actually being implemented can be lengthy, and this is a constant cause of criticism from borrowers. In that context, we have Chinese investors which can offer faster money, often with less strict conditions, should we say. For example, in Cambodia, the Prime Minister takes every opportunity he can to praise Chinese investment, praise Chinese banks for giving quick and easy loans, and also criticizing the World Bank for too many strict guidelines and too many what's the term he uses? Too many conditions. So why are there so many new initiatives that are focusing on infrastructure? That's because there's a huge infrastructure gap. Those statistics from the World Bank in 2014, I think, are unacceptable, considering the amount of wealth that exists in the world, the fact that 1.2 billion people live without electricity, 1 billion people live 2 kilometers from a sealed road, 748 million people lack safe drinking water. This is the context. Obviously, that impacts on the lives of some of the poorest people in the world and holds back development of industries that might be able to contribute to poverty reduction. When we look at China, especially over the last 10, 15 years, its rapid development has been connected to huge infrastructure investment. At the same time, China's also become a major actor globally. So I'm sure everyone has seen pictures like these before, but China is a major investor in all kinds of infrastructure. So transport, subways, hydropower, pipelines, clean energy such as wind, solar, port developments, bridges, trains, and so on. So China, over the last 10 years, has become a major investor, as we already said. So last year, the outbound investment reached 120 billion. That's official investment. There's a lot more that doesn't necessarily get recorded. So if you compare that to 2002, outbound investment was 2.7 billion. So that's in the space of less than 15 years, a jump of more than 45 times. So China's investment plays a huge role in the ASEAN region, and China's the top investor in Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and then investment elsewhere is also increasing. This graph is useful. I don't know if you can see very clearly, but through the 80s and 90s, investment was very low. Then 2001, there's a small uptick. That's when the going out strategy was first announced. Then 2004, restrictions on outbound investment were relaxed, and then this is where you get this climb. Every year, there's a huge increase, and I'm sure this year will be no different. One of the things that's driving this investment is what's being called the new normal now in China. For years, China's had phenomenal GDP growth, and it's been heavily dependent on debt-driven infrastructure investment, housing, heavy industry. So the downside of that has been heavy pollution, which is, for anyone that's lived in China, is a daily struggle, but also overcapacity. You've got piles of cement, steel, glass, aluminium that is going nowhere and is driving prices down. So China is attempting to rebalance the economy, encourage more consumer spending, include more technological innovation at home, and phasing out old technology. But the downside of that is the potential export of overcapacity and export of dated technology. So I think one image that illustrates that quite well, this is, I came across just recently from Bloomberg. This is China's steel exports. I don't know how clear it is back there, but you can see at the top, Southeast Asia took 37% of China's steel exports during the first 3 quarters of this year. To put that in context, you've got Europe and the US, which is trying to limit steel imports from China because they see that as dumping and impacting on domestic industry. At the same time, Southeast Asia has a huge development for steel. China has a massive oversupply of steel. So these are the parts of the puzzle and this is the result. So this is supporting development or feeding into infrastructure development in Southeast Asia, but also potentially stifling the development of steel industries in the region. And I'm sure adding a lot of competition to other suppliers such as Japan or Korea that might be exporting to the region. Finally, in terms of drivers, a more assertive China. I think it can't be denied that China is seeking to assert itself in the region and globally. China is seeking to solidify and expand regional presence. This, you can say, is connected to Xi Jinping's vision of the China dream and the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. These slogans you'll see a lot around China, like in this picture. On every street you'll see pictures of the China dream, returning China to former glory, if you will. So domestically, this includes raising living standards, achieving what the party call the moderately prosperous society. Internationally, China is obviously seeking to play a greater role in political and economic affairs. So expanding the reach and influence of Chinese financial institutions is a key part of this. So where does the AIIB fit into this? As I've already mentioned, China's a major investor through its going out strategy, plays a key role in multilateral development banks, including World Bank, ADB, others. But also, most of China's major overseas investment projects are implemented by policy banks. So China Development Bank, China XacBank, and then to a lesser extent, the commercial banks. Very often the large projects implemented by state-owned enterprises. And as I'm sure everyone knows, in recent years, Chinese companies and banks have been coming under increasing scrutiny for the way that they implement overseas projects. And there's been a few very high-profile cases where things haven't worked out well. One in particular in Myanmar, the Mae Son Dam, that was funded by China Development Bank, and implemented by several Chinese state-owned enterprises. That ran into problem because of massive local opposition and a lack of transparency in the way the project was being developed. And the outcome has been very negative in terms of China's relationship with Myanmar and Myanmar people. China Development Bank, major actor across the region, and the Export-Import Bank, also major actor across the region. And then we've got the big four commercial banks, which I'm sure you've seen around town as well. So the context is China's been going out for a long time. Massive financial flows coming from the policy banks, from the commercial banks. So the AIIB is a new entity, but it is not, it's not the only actor that is facilitating financial flows coming out of China. The bilateral finance from those banks will continue and it will increase, and that's been given this new push from the One Belt, One Road initiative. But the new banks, the new development bank, the AIIB, I think we can say they represent a new stage in the way China is engaging overseas. They're multilateral. So we can't say that these simply serve the interests of China. China, as we'll see in a minute, holds a very large share of voting rights, but that has to be balanced with the fact that there are 56 other members. As was already mentioned, the bank is in its early stages. So even the report that I worked on, every single draft, when I got to the end, I had to go back and rewrite parts of it because this bank developed quickly and in a very short space of time. I think we published that report in in August, and it's already out of date. This keeps changing almost on a monthly basis. So quickly, in terms of what the AIIB is, this was announced in October 2013. A year later, 21 countries signed on as members, all Asian countries. But then by April 2015, that was up to 57 countries, including a lot of non-regional players. China is by far the biggest shareholder. And this is the first multilateral bank that has been led and initiated by China. This resulted in a lot of speculation early on that this was China's bank and it was going to serve Chinese interests, but the Chinese government and the management of the bank have been very quick to dismiss this. Jin Liqun, the president, has said this is not a Chinese bank, it's a bank owned by all of the 57 countries, which is true, but the ownership is very varied. In terms of its purpose, it's very much focused on infrastructure. And although it says it's a development bank, a lot of the way it's structured and the way it's likely to operate, a lot of people think looks more like an investment bank. The focus on infrastructure, but with a broad definition of infrastructure. There's also some social infrastructure in there. Infrastructure and other productive sectors. When I was at the AIIB's first annual meeting in June, and someone said, what are other productive sectors? And Jin Liqun, the president, said, the definition of other productive sectors is other productive sectors. So we're still left guessing as to where exactly the money's going to go, apart from the early projects. But apart from that, up front in the bank's charter, there's a focus on cooperation, partnership, collaboration with existing players in the international development finance world. So while this is a new institution that's marketing itself as a new model that's fit for Asia's needs, it's very eager to emphasize cooperation with the existing framework. There's a large focus on mobilizing private finance, and that's likely to come through public and private partnerships. As I said, 57 members, that's going to grow. So next year, it might actually have more members than the Asian Development Bank. And all 10 ASEAN countries are members, and they joined very early on. I included this. This is interesting to see in terms of the struggle that the AIIB faced early on to attract members. In the first year, 21 Asian members joined. So this first section is 1 year, October 2013 to October 2014. This last section, where about 20 members joined, is 15 days. So after the UK joined, and then a couple of other European actors joined, there was a scramble before the deadline, and the balance between regional members and non-regional members evened out slightly. One of the reasons why was there was a lot of pressure, allegedly, behind the scenes from the US, pushing allies not to join. Obviously that didn't work, and there were a lot of images like this in the global media of the US being left behind. The AIIB left the station. So the US and Japan are not members, but no doubt they'll be thinking about the implications of joining. The structure and management of the bank, 75% of the shares are reserved for regional members, and it can't go below that. China holds more than 30% of the bank's shares and 28% of the voting rights, so it means it can exercise veto over certain decisions. But as more members join, China's share will be diluted. An important thing is that the bank has a very diluted workforce when you compare to other banks. So the World Bank, I had to write it down because it's so huge. The World Bank has more than 10,000 staff and more than 120 offices. The AIIB aims to have 100 staff by the end of the year in one office with $100 billion. This shows how drastic the gap is between China's voting rights and others. So almost 30% of the voting rights in China's hand. The next, India with 8.3, and then after that, Russia with 6.5. So while we can say it's not necessarily China's bank, China has a huge amount of influence over the way the bank is run. And here, with Aung San Suu Kyi, Myanmar was the first country in the world to join as a full member. But if you look at the subscription of the Mekong countries compared to China, they're a fraction of the size. In terms of the first batch of projects, there's a focus on transport, focus on energy. But what's interesting about this, if you look at the final column, it asks if those projects are co-financed. So only one of the first projects is not co-financed. The rest are co-financed with ADB, with the UK DFID, World Bank, IFC. And in all of those cases, those institutions' safeguard policies will be used and procurement policies. So this is a bank that's learning to find its way and cooperating with the other banks. That's not to say that it's not a competitor, but right now they're working side by side, perhaps reluctantly, but we'll see how that pans out. And in terms of the proposed projects again, 4 World Bank co-finance projects, 2 that are not clear, and 1 that will be a standalone project. I'm going to rush through this because there's not much time, but President Jin Liqun takes every opportunity he can to say that AIIB will be lean, clean, and green. Lean, with a stripped down management, stripped down bureaucracy, more basic policies in terms of facilitating the implementation of proposed projects. Clean, as in zero tolerance of corruption, and green, targeting green investments. That's another issue that is quite vague. At the annual meeting again, there was a 1-hour panel discussion on how AIIB will support green investment, but no one ever defined what green investment is. So we had a very nice discussion about how it's going to do that, but no one could actually say what is a green project. So there's a lot still that needs to be pinned down. In terms of the implications, some people think this is a threat to the existing financial order. This is the first Asian-led multilateral development bank. 75% of the shares reserved for Asian countries. China has a massive share. AIIB is promoting itself as more efficient and more suited to regional needs. At the same time, others are saying that AIIB is a new member of the global financial order. There you can see Jin Liqun signing exchanging agreements with ADB and World Bank. They have MOUs with most of the top key multilateral development banks. And they've also hired a lot of ex-World Bank, ex-ADB, IFC staff as staff at AIIB or as consultants, including for development of policies. And so at the moment, the approach of AIIB is not radically different to the approach of other IFIs. It is a more streamlined version. It's taken 2 years to get where it probably took the World Bank a lot longer. There's the concern of lowering standards. This is a concern for people from the NGO community. I'm sure Luz will talk more about this. The bank does have environmental and social standards. There was a very brief, quite inadequate consultation process where NGOs were able to comment. But it's actually there and it's in place. There are things that we are concerned about. But early on, people were talking about whether or not the bank would even have these kind of standards. But after more and more Western and democratic countries joined, I think it was inevitable that some kind of policies were going to be adopted. And so now there is an environmental social framework in place, and we have to wait and see how that is implemented. At the moment, there's no body that is actually there to see how that is implemented. There is Luz, what is it called? The Compliance, Integrity, and Effectiveness Unit? Yes. That has been set up that will deal with complaints and also assess whether policies are being followed. That is in place, but it has no procedures yet, and it doesn't have a complete staff. So even though projects are actually being rolled out, if someone has a complaint, there is a policy that says they can complain, but there's no address they can send the complaint to. So this is a side effect of the fact that the bank has developed incredibly quickly. And so as the bank has developed, the policies and the institutions, the policies and the structures are struggling to keep up with the bank. Linked to that is openness, transparency. NGO Forum and AIIB has tried to communicate with the bank and received some responses, and other NGOs have been trying to find out information about how it will, for example, implement its energy sector strategy, develop its energy sector strategy. The consultation around environmental and social standards was highly flawed. It was announced that it was happening, and then it started about 4 days later and was supposed to run for 1 week, all in English, all by video conference, even though English is not the first language in any of the regional countries. So there was a lot of criticism there. Now the process for developing its energy strategy is a lot more open, but it remains to be seen if civil society voices will be heard. Moving away from the structure of the bank to something maybe a bit more philosophical is, where is the real infrastructure gap? We see this massive push towards developing new institutions, new funds to focus on infrastructure, but as Manfred was saying, we need to think about what is sustainable infrastructure. We often see these figures of the gap in terms of trillions of dollars in terms of infrastructure. That it's very clear. I've lived in countries around the region. I've seen the state of roads and bridges and the social infrastructure as well. There are huge gaps, but it's not necessarily a lack of finance very often. There's a lack of bankable projects, and what makes a bankable project is not just can it make money, but is the local situation politically stable? How are the environmental conditions? How are the social conditions? A lot of projects that regional governments are seeking funding for, donors, investors do not want to go near because they know that it will be a problem. They know that there will be a headache with environmental issues, social issues, and there's also the fear that profits will be lost. For example, we've seen in Cambodia several times toll roads that are unpopular simply being cancelled by the Prime Minister leading up to election time, even though a company has a 15, 20-year contract for the toll road. So bankability is a huge issue. AIIB is seeking to raise private capital to invest in infrastructure, but to do this, they need to seek bankable projects, which is a challenge. In terms of AIIB and Chinese influence, clearly the AIIB was a huge achievement for China. It's developed incredibly quickly and attracted members from around the world. But it's important to keep in mind it's multilateral. It can't only serve Chinese interests. There are too many other members. The way voting is broken down, European nations are broken into 2 constituencies. So if they work together, they have a block of votes which can start to rival the Chinese bloc. So it has procurement standards in place. Any companies from any country can bid for AIIB projects. So it won't necessarily favor Chinese companies, although we know Chinese companies can offer a good price for infrastructure development, and that's why they win a lot of contracts with the AIIB and with the World Bank and others. So in terms of where this fits in terms of the One Belt, One Road, I'm sure everyone is very familiar with this. The One Belt, One Road has two main focuses. You've got the land-based Silk Road economic belt, and then the 21st century maritime Silk Road. These are not very clearly defined, and within there are 6 major economic corridors that join the 2. This was first announced in 2013, but then there was no detailed document released on One Belt, One Road until 2015. And even that document is not necessarily the clearest thing that you'll ever read. We still don't know who's in charge of this, which countries are included, where is the money coming from, what are the motivations behind it, and who benefits. Or you could possibly answer these questions 5 different ways depending on your perspective. So there's a lot of speculation about what the One Belt, One Road is, and I think also a lot of misunderstanding about what it is. But the key focus is it aims to develop a network of interconnectivity. This term interconnectivity is mentioned again and again in terms of Chinese finance now. Interconnectivity and industrial cooperation are 2 key terms. So it covers 60 to 70 countries. We don't even know exactly which countries come within that. And there's no central planning. There's no OBOR committee that says this is a One Belt, One Road project, this is One Belt, One Road project. It's not a financing facility. If you look at the vision document, it basically supports investment in everything. So all kinds of infrastructure, trade, but also environmental protection, tourism, cultural exchanges, and what China calls people-to-people exchanges. What we can say really is this is not so much a new initiative, rather a repackaged initiative. China's been going out since the early 2000s. It's had a lot of success, it's encountered a lot of challenges and problems. But the One Belt, One Road, I think, myself at least, I view as going global 2.0. It's a repackaging, a rebranding, and it's focused on more connected infrastructure rather than sporadic projects, which has been the theme of a lot of outbound state-backed Chinese investment. So in terms of the AIIB and One Belt, One Road, a lot of commentary conflates the two. They're distinct but associated, let's say. AIIB is an institution, and it's a multilateral institution. One Belt, One Road is an initiative, and quite a vague initiative sometimes. Xi Jinping has encouraged AIIB and pretty much every Chinese bank to invest in One Belt, One Road projects. So there's a clear link. But also many other banks, many other institutions have shown interest in the One Belt, One Road. And there's no specific categorization of a project as One Belt, One Road. For example, in Cambodia, there are projects which have been on the cards for years, or even were already in development when One Belt, One Road was announced, or even complete. But now those companies say this is a One Belt, One Road project. Same with the Lao Railway. It's been under discussion for a decade. Now it's a One Belt, One Road project. So this is the new packaging for outbound investment. But AIIB, One Belt, One Road, they were both announced at the same time, late 2013. In terms of the geography, the objectives, infrastructure, interconnectivity, industrial cooperation, there's a clear overlap. If you look at the map of the AIIB members, and then look back at the One Belt, One Road, there's a clear overlap. But AIIB only, I say only, has $100 billion. People are estimating all over the place as to what is required to implement this broad strategy of the One Belt, One Road, but it's in the trillions. So you have the policy banks, all of them have set up One Belt, One Road funds. China Development Bank, Export-Import Bank, Agriculture Development Bank. The commercial banks, the big four, all have One Belt, One Road funds. And now you also have investment funds, investment banks and companies that are also starting to package outbound investment through this prism of the One Belt, One Road, including the Silk Road Fund, which was established specifically for this. So in terms of the implications, I think this links back to the drivers of these new developments that we discussed at the beginning. China's been going out for years. It has good relationships throughout the One Belt, One Road region. They will likely continue to develop these relationships. It will increase opportunities for Chinese companies to export technology and also production capacity. So to develop the Lao Railway, one of China's biggest cement companies is setting up now the biggest cement factory in Laos. And it says that will specifically supply the Chinese railway. So we have oversupply of cement, oversupply of steel in China, and then we have a huge railway going through the middle of Laos. So these are opportunities to export that overcapacity and, from the Chinese perspective, contribute to mutual benefits. Chinese companies benefit, the Lao people benefit from new infrastructure and the opportunities associated with that. Of course, there's the potential to increase global influence of China throughout the region, which I think we'll definitely be coming back to in the next few presentations. So in conclusion, this is actually quite tricky for me. I wanted to get 2-3 clear concluding points, and I didn't. I got 3 slides, but I won't read them all to you. But it's hard to make conclusions about this, because it's developing. Like I said, the report is out of date, and I published it 2 months ago. Every time you look, there's a new project or there's a new statement. This is an evolving landscape. So What will the impact of the AIIB be? We don't know. There's projects approved, but they've not started implementation yet. One Belt, One Road is so vague in places that we don't know what its implications are going to be. But it's important to view these things in context. Chinese outbound investment has been increasing for 10 years, and it's going to continue to increase. Chinese influence in the region is going to continue to increase. And these different financial institutions, whether they're bilateral or multilateral, will support this. China sees its role in global political decisions and the financial world as being less than it should be, let's say. China, if we look in terms of the Chinese dream, this vision of the Great Rejuvenation, Xi Jinping and the leadership see China having been kept down for considerable time, and it's, in their view, time to stand up, especially in the context of Obama's pivot to Asia, which, as you say, has not been as effective as hoped by the Obama administration, but it made China nervous. We can see these financial institutions as part of the pushback against that. And you can see recent trips by senior Chinese officials around the ASEAN region. Recently, Xi Jinping was in Cambodia, sorry. The high-level meetings with the Prime Minister and Council of Ministers and various other officials. But behind that came all the state-owned enterprises. So all the energy companies, construction companies came and met with deputy prime ministers, and a lot of agreements were signed for new projects. And the language of the Chinese government around One Belt, One Road, interconnectivity, industrial cooperation, is now being repeated by the Cambodian government. So you can see that this is starting to transfer. And at the same time, you have, using the example of Cambodia again, administration that is very quick to criticize Western meddling and praise Chinese hands-off approach to investment and supporting what they see as the needs of Cambodia. And recent events in the Philippines also show that this charm offensive is working. Like you say, Duterte is not dumb, as you said. He's playing off the different actors against each other, as is Cambodia, as are various other nations. So it remains to be seen how effective this push to accelerate outbound investment will be, but I'm sure we will be here discussing this again. This is going to continue for years to come. So development of AIIB is important. It might change the way that other financial institutions work. A key concern for a lot of NGOs, civil society groups and others is that maybe World Bank ADB will start to dilute their standards to compete with the AIIB. Maybe they want to speed up that process because when it does get to a stage where the AIIB can compete, the World Bank might be in trouble. If it takes 2 years to get from a proposal to the start of a project being implemented, they're facing serious competition potentially. Environmental and social standards. The AIIB has developed its framework, as I mentioned. It has gaps. Still a lot of improvement to be made. Is it going to drag down the standards of the other banks? We don't know. We already see dilution, but that came before the AIIB, perhaps in anticipation of the bank. But I think to finish, going back to Manfred's point, this idea of sustainable infrastructure. I've covered a lot of issues, and it's been a struggle, you might have noticed. But one thing that we really need to get past, I think, is this simplistic idea that more infrastructure equals more development. We see this kind of thing repeated again and again. But we need good infrastructure. Infrastructure that serves the need of the people, infrastructure that is responsible, respectful of social and environmental rights. And unless we move in that direction, especially across the region, I work in countries where institutions, legal frameworks, rule of law is undeveloped, and in some cases going backwards. So an influx of huge infrastructure spending is potentially dangerous to a lot of people. So I think I'll leave that discussion to Luz, perhaps. But what my organization and organizations I work for are looking at is understanding these new actors and understanding how they will develop their approaches to really serve the needs of their borrowers and most importantly the population of those countries. Thank you very much.